What is up, guys? It is AJ. Francis Ngannou sat down with Ariel Helwani and he exposed all about why the UFC and him are now parting ways. And he also hinted at what could be next for him. A major takeaway that I got was that him and Dana White's relationship has been on the fritz since before the Stipe Miocic fight. It seems like Dana White didn't like what he had said in a contract renegotiation years back, that being that he would like to just renegotiate after every fight, which is just something that the UFC doesn't do. Obviously, Francis Ngannou being, the top tier heavyweight and now champion, leaving the UFC as the baddest man on the planet, which hasn't happened. His power, you think, would be able to sway the UFC a little bit more than the vast majority. From what he claimed, yes, they were willing to pay him well. Ariel Helwani brought up the $8 million deal that Brock Lesnar had to fight at UFC 200. Francis Ngannou kind of hinted at, no, I wasn't making $8 million a fight. But he claimed that it wasn't so much that he didn't want to sign because of how much money they were paying him, but the fact that they weren't going to meet any terms that he wanted specifically for him. How I kind of look at it, why does the UFC not bend just a little bit for the biggest, baddest fighter on the planet, right? The heavyweight champion, I personally believe, should get some leeway. I think if you're the champion of the UFC, as big as you are, and people will say, oh, Ngannou's last pay-per-view got 200,000 buys. If you guys remember, the UFC sabotaged him. They gave a weaker card on that pay-per-view, I think, with the intention of, let's try to diminish Ngannou's value, so our renegotiation process, we don't have to bend backwards for. Now, the things that he asked that I thought might have been a little bit unrealistic, but it shows Francis is, really looking out for all fighters. He said that he would like, a health insurance plan, not just for himself, but for all fighters. Of course, he's probably trying to, take something that's a little bit too far out of reach, but I like where he's going. He's a fighter for the fighters. He also mentioned having a fighter advocate at the UFC meetings that's very pro-fighter, probably something else the UFC would not be any bit interested in doing, because in turn, this could just lose them money with fighters and, expecting more, asking for more, etc. Something that I do think they could have bended a little bit for, as he said he wanted an individual sponsorship, not just to, be going with the UFC sponsors, but his own. I feel like being a champion with big name value, you should be able to get a little bit of ploy for yourself, right? Bring in a little extra money. They're not going to bend. The UFC Africa thing, which it seemed like the UFC wasn't opposed to, but now that whole UFC Africa plan might be shit because Ngannou's gone. Adesanya doesn't have the belt, and Usman lost the title. Granted, he's fighting against Edwards again at 286, and maybe he reclaims the throne, and that UFC Africa card really could be a possibility in 2024. Don't feel great about it, though, without the likes of Ngannou or Adesanya, too, because can you imagine? You have like the trifecta that they had before. It's dead. How I'm looking at it is what Francis Ngannou kind of claimed. The UFC tried to push, especially Dana White, take the money and fight. That's it. Take the money, shut up, fight. We don't want to make any exclusive deals. I think a major thing that Francis wanted was boxing. He's claimed since he was, very young that he wanted to be a championship level boxer. The opportunity to fight Tyson Fury is definitely on the horizon. So besides, complaining about the UFC a bit, not necessarily even like in a very negative light. He wasn't absolutely shitting on the UFC. He said he appreciated them a lot. It was mostly directed towards Dana White specifically. It seems like Dana White and him did not have a great relationship. Dana White also kind of, trying to expose Francis Ngannou. Oh, he wants easier fights, which is just simply untrue. He actually said, this being Francis Ngannou, he wanted a 3-fight UFC deal. That's what it was going to be. And he said the matchups that he anticipated were John Jones twice and Ciryl Gane. No way are those easy fights. Francis Ngannou is not leaving the UFC because he's looking for easy fights. He's a fighter who wants to be free. Problem lies upon that there are no heavyweights outside of the UFC, in my opinion, that bring any anticipation. I mean, what is he going to do? Jump to Bellator and fight Ryan Bader, who is a former UFC light heavyweight who never was able to get to the pinnacle, which is championship level, and I don't think would fare well against the top 10 heavyweights in the UFC either. Does he go to PFL? Ante Daliha, he'll starch him in a round. Bruno Capoloza, who's lost to guys that were just bouncing off the regional scene. It seems like mixed martial arts outside of the UFC is going to be kind of a dead zone for Francis Ngannou. I don't think he's going to find many opportunities. He's not going to jump to one championship. Maybe somebody else that leaves the UFC. I don't know. Does Brock Lesnar get swayed by PFL and you do Brock Lesnar versus Francis Ngannou in a PFL pay-per-view? Very speculative. I'm not saying that's any of it possible. Nobody talked about it. But what Francis said for a fact is he wants to dabble in boxing and he's expecting a professional boxing debut as his next contest, which gets me excited. I want to see Francis Ngannou get the life-changing payday. In mixed martial arts, maybe he could have made 2, 3, 4 million even in a fight. In professional boxing, he can make 10 million. He might even be able to make 15 million, which is insane amounts of money. The fight that he wants specifically is definitely towards the Tyson Fury side. He did mention how Fury retired, and then he ended up now saying he wants to fight Usyk, so that matchup might not be guaranteed on the table, but I think Tyson Fury is going to be like, all right, we got Ngannou free now, the baddest man on the planet, the heavyweight champion of the UFC, which granted, he's not the heavyweight champion anymore of the UFC, but he is still the #1 heavyweight mixed martial artist on the planet. And I think a fight between him and Tyson Fury could be bonkers. Fury had mentioned doing it in a mixed rules contest. I believe that was smoke and mirrors. I don't think he wants to stand across from Francis Ngannou with 4-ounce gloves in a cage under boxing rules because it will just take one punch. And I do believe Francis Ngannou has the knockout power to flatline even Tyson Fury, who came back from the dead against Deontay Wilder. With a 4-ounce glove, the game's completely different. As sick it would be, can you imagine they did it bare knuckle rule set? I know Dave Feldman wants to sign Francis Ngannou. I just don't know how realistic it is for him to jump, through some hoops and go to bare knuckle. Even if they offered him major money, I don't think they could come up with enough because I think Francis Ngannou wants pro boxing money. Tyson Fury fight potentially on the horizon. He said his return should be by July, and he said it's either Fury or Anthony Joshua. Those are two names that he mentioned. Ariel asked about, what about Deontay Wilder? It doesn't seem like the Deontay Wilder fight's going to happen, I guess, due to contracts and whatnot. I feel like the Fury fight could be easier to set up, and I think this is a marquee fight. We do it under boxing rules, sure. Yes, it does not favor Francis, and most likely Francis Ngannou will lose a boxing match. But if you know mixed martial arts, does that really take any stock away from Francis? He lost to the best boxer in his sport. Tyson Fury's not jumping to MMA and fighting Francis. There's no chance of that, but Francis Ngannou will have the cojones to go jump to the boxing ring and make life-changing money. I'm all for Francis versus Fury. I like that he also mentioned Anthony Joshua. That could be an interesting fight too. And you know what? A more so winnable, I don't want to say very winnable, a more so winnable fight would be Joshua versus Francis Ngannou. I do think Tyson Fury, just too much boxing skills, but Anthony Joshua has been knocked out before in boxing. He has been hit by punches that I think Francis Ngannou maybe could land. Granted, in either of those matchups, there's no way Francis Ngannou is even close to a favorite. I'd say he'd be plus 700 against Joshua, maybe plus 1,000 against Tyson Fury, but he's making the life-changing money. And I think the thing would be, when these boxing fights end, though, let's say he does boxing, he loses to Tyson Fury. Is the UFC going to be spiteful and not re-sign him? Because I don't think MMA outside of the UFC at heavyweight has any interest. There's nobody for Francis Ngannou to fight in mixed martial arts. He said he still wants to do MMA, but MMA at heavyweight outside of the UFC is not it. At light heavyweight, you can find great fighters in Bellator. At middleweight, too. Lightweight, absolutely. Bantamweight. There's good fighters at welterweight. It's essentially every weight class there's quality outside of the UFC opposed to heavyweight. I think that there's decent enough fighters, but they're top 30, top 40 guys in the world. There is no one that I can think of outside of the UFC in the heavyweight division that could compete with the top 6, top 7, top 8 even of the UFC heavyweight division. Maybe a Ryan Bader could find his way to break into a top 10, but it's not top tier. So Francis Ngannou, I think, needs to stick with the boxing game outside of the UFC. Dial in, focus completely on throwing straight hands. Let's get him the Fury fight, the life-changing payday, and then maybe a year from now, 2 years from now, we can get him re-signed up to the UFC, and that John Jones super fight could eventually happen. Because there's no MMA outside the UFC for him. And that's just the God honest truth. It's unfortunate to say. I like how many terms he asked for. I know that him and Dana White have a personal beef. And Dana White, at the end of the day, we know how Dana White is. He's Dana White. He's a bit of a hardo. And he's got a little something with Ngannou, not liking what he said once, and it seems like their relationship has been on the fritz since. And that's what, like 5 years ago now? Maybe more? I don't know. Don't quote me on the exact math, but that was a long time back. For me, Francis Ngannou, Tyson Fury should be next. That's the only fight outside. I guess Anthony Joshua could work too, but boxing is the only thing I want to see for him outside the UFC. Because there's no MMA fights, unless you call in Brock Lesnar and they do it in PFL. But aside from that, there's no active heavyweights outside of the UFC that intrigue me at all for an Ngannou fight. I think he would knock them all out, but I wouldn't even be that interested. I'd still watch because I like Francis Ngannou. As an Ngannou fan, I'd want to support him. But it's not going to sell many pay-per-views if it's Ngannou versus Ante Delija for PFL. Guys, I hope you enjoyed. If you didn't see the Ariel Helwani interview, it's a long one. It's about an hour and a half. I feel like I gave you a good amount of juice from what it was about. You know, it wasn't as informative as I was hoping. I wanted to get some absolutes. I wanted the numbers of what the contract looked like from the UFC. We didn't get the exact numbers, but we know it's less than 8 million. I wanted to know exactly what was next for Ngannou. He hinted at boxing. He mentioned Tyson Fury, and he wants Tyson Fury to hit him up. So I think the Tyson Fury fight is option 1, with option 2 probably being Anthony Joshua. Guys, smash the likes. If you're new, subscribe. Let me know what you think in the comments. Much love, and I will see you all in the next one. Peace.